My name is Willie Friar, and I started working in the oil industry in 1974 when I graduated with a civil engineering degree from the University of Virginia, and actually went straight on up to Anchorage and then Prudhoe Bay. And I worked initially on the British Petroleum gathering centers as a field construction engineer during their installation, 74, 1975, 76. 77, getting the oil ready for introduction into the pipeline. Then I left the slope for a while and came back in 1984 working for ARCO as a construction engineer on their pipelines and the Lisburn Production Center and drill sites, the seawater injection plant, and a number of other facilities on the slope. Spent a little bit of time actually at the fabrication yard down in Portland, Oregon as the construction manager. And then when ARCO was purchased by British Petroleum, I worked for BP for a number of years and retired in 2018. My background or degree was in civil engineering. And my fourth year at the University of Virginia, we had a project to figure out how to move the equipment from the heavy ocean-going barges onto land at Prudhoe Bay. And I got interested in Prudhoe and really wanted to work on one of the big construction projects. My first preference would have been the bridge tunnel between England and France, but in the mid-70s they did not have funding. Actually, they didn't get funding until the mid-80s. And by that time I was already married and had kids. So that left the Alaska pipeline, and that was what drew my interest. I wanted to work on a large construction project. It was actually a lot of fun because you got a lot of experience quickly, and it was like being thrown into the ocean. You had to learn mechanical, you had to learn electrical, you had to learn instrumentation. In school we had construction engineering, so we learned the basics of construction and equipment and estimating the cost of different projects and you know, how many man-hours it would take, whatnot, but learning the details, you know, and you know, interpreting the specific drawings that came in was a continual learning experience. Well, when the pipeline was approved to be built through Congress, then I had an opportunity to write to the major engineering companies that were doing different portions of the pipeline. Back then you wrote letters, that was how it was done. So you'd write a letter and it'd take a while to get a response. Unfortunately, I didn't get any responses, so I ended up talking to one of the professors and asking him what he would suggest. And he said, well, speak to a man here in Charlottesville. He just sold his construction company in Anchorage to Brown and Root, and he might be able to give you some good advice. So I made an appointment with Preston Locker, went into his office, had a big desk, and right behind him was a polar bear hide, so it made you feel, okay, this guy's for real. Anyway, Preston wrote a very nice letter of introduction to the president of Locker Construction in Anchorage, Warren Moore, and he sent me an offer which I then took up and went to Anchorage, landed in Anchorage, and actually worked in the office for a week on the plans for the Tonsina camp. And somebody came into the drafting office there and said, hey, how would you like to go up to Prudhoe and work for a while? You'd be living in a camp. Naive as I was, I thought, a tent, hot dogs and beans around campfire for a month can't be too bad. I like camping, it'll be good. So I said, sure. So they shipped me up to Prudhoe Bay, and if you have low expectations, that's a good thing, because even though we were just living in an ATCO trailer, the food was great. You know, you had a nice, dry, warm room, so it was a good start. I've already mentioned most of them. In the 70s, it was building the gathering centers for BP, which is where the oil, the crude actually coming out of the ground is separated. The water and gas is taken out, the sludge is taken out, the impurities, so that the oil, just basically oil, is being shipped over to Pump Station 1 to go down the pipeline. And then after the gathering centers were completed, then I went back to Virginia and worked on a hydroelectric dam for 4 years. And then when it was being finished, ARCO actually called down there and said they were starting up phase 2 and phase 3 of field development, asked if I'd be willing to come back up. I said, yeah, I definitely will. So I flew up for an interview, and they actually flew me to Prudhoe Bay. And the gentleman interviewed me when I walked in the office was Jim Butcher from Locker Construction Company. And he said, Willie Friar, I don't need to talk to you. Get out of here. Anyway, that was when I started working for ARCO. And I worked for ARCO for 20 years till that was 1981, so until they were purchased and became part of British Petroleum. And actually, I'd always hoped to come back to Alaska, so I was very fortunate that when I was up here, I'd met a woman that was born and raised in Alaska. And we got married while we were down in Virginia. So when ARCO made the offer, I said, are you ready to go back to Alaska? Oh yeah, let's go. So it was very easy from a family perspective to make the transition back to Alaska, which isn't always easy for some men. Since '81, we've lived here, and both my daughters are born here, so Alaska's home. It was a short stint, kind of in between when ARCO was purchased and going back to work for BP, where I worked for Nana Pacific, which was a design build company that we started, and we were doing work for the government and for the oil industry. And then when the oil pipelines leaked and BP promised to have them replaced in a year, which was not really feasible, it took 2 years to get the pipelines replaced. I actually went back to work for BP as a BP employee, kind of from 2006 to 2018. Well, several projects. One of them was kind of groundbreaking, no pun intended, but the Grind and Inject project was a big deal during my career. And throughout the years, all of the drilling muds and cuttings had been stored in reserve pits all over the world. That was standard industry practice. So there were reserve pits all over Prudhoe Bay and Kapark where the drilling muds and cuttings had been stored. And the trustees of Alaska and Resource Development Council brought suit against ARCO, claiming that the pits were leaching water into the streams of the United States of America. So the settlement was that ARCO and BP and Exxon were going to clean up the reserve pits, but the question was how. So we evaluated different techniques. One of the ideas was to dig a regional hole, which was basically 400 feet by 400 feet by 40 feet deep, put the muds and cuttings in there, put the overburden back over the top, and then let it freeze back in place. And we tried that out at drill site 3, and it worked, and we monitored it for a number of years, but the environmental agencies didn't like that idea very much. So we came up with the idea of maybe we can grind it up and re-inject the muds and cuttings into a formation that's not associated with oil and it's kind of isolated from other areas. But nobody knew how to do that. It had never been done before. Plus, there was actually 5 million cubic yards of muds and cuttings on the North Slope that had to be taken care of, which if you look at the ARCO Tower, which is now the ConocoPhillips Tower in downtown Anchorage, volume-wise, it's like 50 of those buildings, top to bottom, full of muds and cuttings that had to be dealt with. So we tried actually grinding up the muds and cuttings in a typical ball mill from the mining industry, mixing it into a slurry, and then under high pressure injecting it back into the formation. And environmental agencies liked it. We had to get it past Judge Holland, he liked it. We had to get it approved by the ARCO, BP, and Exxon management. They liked it because once it's down there, it's taken care of. It's not going to come back to haunt you at a later date. But we weren't sure if we could get that much muds and cuttings down. So we had a test well out at drill site 4, and we injected muds and cuttings for a year, and we got like 200+ thousand yards down the well in one season. And I calculated out the math of how much it cost to drill a well to inject muds and cuttings if this one plugged up. And I asked, we had 3 PhD reservoir engineers, one from ARCO, one from BP, and one from Exxon. I said, how much can we get into a well? And initially they said, well, the Exxon PhD said 25,000 yards and it'll plug off. The ARCO PhD said 50,000 yards and it'll plug off. The BP PhD said 75,000. And these guys are all proud of their expertise. I mean, they almost come to blows when they're arguing about how much can it actually go. And I said, well, none of those are going to work. If we don't get 400,000 yards, economically the project is not going to be a success. It's got to be 400,000 yards down a well. And the test well we had out at drill site 4, we had put 200,000 yards down and had to go back to the environmental agencies and ask for another year to test. They said, okay, we'll give you another year because we like that idea. So we tested another year and we got 412,000 yards down this one well. So okay, that's the way we're going to do. So we did grind inject. Over the years, we got all 5 million yards injected. We actually went out and drilled some designer wells that weren't located near any other well bores. And I think, I got off the project, but kind of kept an eye on it. And I know they got over 1 million yards in a single well. And now that has become, this was in 1994, 1995, so 20 years ago. 30 years ago, sorry. But now it's industry practice all over the world. I was the project manager for the team, so we had several, people that worked it. And I actually went down to Louisiana where they were taking the Gulf muds and cuttings and dropping it down a well bore, but they were going into a salt cavern, actually above the salt cavern where there was a huge void, just kind of by gravity dropped in and then got distributed. Whereas we were actually somehow fracking going out into a formation, into a very friable limestone formation that was trapped in between shale layers. So it was a different concept. We had to take the slurry and run it through injection pumps that bumped the pressure up to, it could go as high as 1,800 PSI, but I think we were usually injecting around 12 or 1,300 PSI down into the formation, and it was radially going out from the well bore. But you think about it, 5 million cubic yards of basically dirt, being disposed of in an area where, it's locked in place for forever. And the other interesting project was when BP purchased ARCO, and I was actually working in town at this stage, and the field manager, Bill Johnson, came into the office and said, hey, Willie, let's figure out some monument that we can remember the ARCO heritage somehow. So I thought about building an ARCO Spark, the ARCO emblem, which is kind of a diamond-shaped emblem, and thought maybe we could put that on the discovery well, from the original discovery well from 1968, which was actually 2 miles off the road. You couldn't ever drive to the original, and you still can't drive to the discovery well because it's 2 miles off on the tundra. So I was trying to figure out how large a pipe I would need to build this ARCO Spark. And I looked from the ARCO building to Westchester Lagoon, and there's a radio tower there that I could see quite visibly, and it's 2 miles. So I'll go down and measure what the size of that is. So we got 16-inch pipe, and we built a 16-foot spark, 16 feet across, out of this pipe with 90s and mitered ends, so it looks like an ARCO Spark. And then we put it on a pedestal 10 feet above the ground, so when you're at the closest point, which is behind the CGF, looking at the monument, it looks like the spark is sitting on the ground with the curvature of the earth because the 10 feet is below the horizon. So you just see this ARCO Spark out there. And we got it registered with the National Historic Landmarks in Washington, D.C., so it should be there forever. And we put a time capsule in the bottom of it. And one of the BP construction managers said, Willie, how'd you get Exxon, BP, and ARCO to all approve the AFE to put up this ARCO Spark? He said, I never figured Exxon and BP would approve that AFE, but we got them, and the Spark is there, and it's a kind of a tourist stop now on the Prudhoe tour to stop, and we've got 2 placards there that describe the early days at Prudhoe, Exxon, ARCO, and BP people that worked up there. 1974, there wasn't very much infrastructure up in Prudhoe Bay, so it was, even though it was better than a campfire and a tent, it was still very primitive, and we were living in ATCO structures, actually in the Halliburton camp. It's like a 50-man camp, and I remember icicles in the shower, hanging down in the shower in the winter. But then we would drive from there to Gathering Center 1, 15, 20 miles every day back and forth. And there was a 50 or a 500-man man camp, Muckluck 1, which was pretty rough too. And they were still building the BOC, which was the BP Operations Center camp, and they were building the ARCO PBOC camp, so those were still under construction. But yeah, it was not a whole lot of equipment, not a whole lot of support. We'd wait for the newspaper to come up on the airplane every day to get news from the outside world. There wasn't any TV, or we didn't have phones. I think the closest phone might have been 20 miles away. So the camps, they would fly in a movie or two for the week, with, 16 millimeter reel, and you'd trade your film with another camp's film so you could get a different movie later in the week. But that was kind of the entertainment. Books and movies, you had to entertain yourself. 10, 12-hour days, 7 days a week. Staff was 4 weeks on and a week off. Craft was 9 weeks on and a week off. It was long, long work hours. And then some of the guys would work 6 months and then go out. Talk about getting stir crazy. But after 6 months, the companies forced you to go out because it was remote, it was rough. It took a certain quality of person to work up there. And initially, when I first went up in '74, we had a relatively small crew. And the people were mostly, the workers and staff were pretty much all Alaskans. We didn't get the travelers till '75 and '76 when things really started picking up. So it was interesting to talk to the old timers. The ironworker crew I recall, it's like 6 or 7 ironworkers, and they had just come off the RCA job where they were putting the towers on the top of the mountain peaks that relayed the signals from Prudhoe Bay all the way down to Anchorage and Valdez. But all of these repeaters were at the very top of the mountain peaks all the way down the line. And these guys had just come off of that job and were now working on the gathering center. And the ironworker foreman, his name was Gene Hester, and he was an old, crusty old ironworker. And he was actually, before World War II, he was working on the Adak Dutch Harbor. He was in Dutch Harbor when the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor, and he had pictures taken, and the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor as a part of the Midway campaign, sort of a diversionary attack. And he had pictures that the U.S. government actually got from him of the Japanese planes coming in. So, and he also homesteaded out in Eureka near Gunsight Mountain. So he had some great stories. Another fella, Jim Lawyer, he was the carpenter superintendent, and he had come up as a boy with his family from the Midwest during the Depression for the farm experiment out in Palmer, where they brought Midwest farmers to develop farming community in Palmer, and then he was up there as a carpenter superintendent. So it was interesting to talk to these old Alaskans from, the 30s and 40s that were up there at Prudhoe working. Well, the very first project would have been the gathering centers, GC1, GC2, and it was just very difficult to get any plans or materials. It was kind of slow in coming north, and we knew we had a deadline to have the gathering centers and the drill sites and the wells all online, ready to send oil to Prudhoe, or to the pipeline when it got finished. So it was kind of a race to the finish, and it was difficult to get all the material you needed, all the valves, all the pumps. But being as it was a high priority project for the country back during the oil embargo days, we actually had U.S. First come rights to certain materials as a priority to get what we needed if we kind of played that card. My work was mainly managing the projects, managing the different crews, making sure that the scope of work was lined out. They had the drawings they needed, the materials they needed, any equipment they needed, planning for the next job, reporting back to British Petroleum people of how the project was going, what the issues were, if there were any problems. You had to have somebody there that could interpret the drawings and plan the work and, do the engineering in the field. A lot of times, we would actually have to do engineering in the field and then send the drawings back to the home office and say, here's what it looks like. I think the biggest change, and I think the most beneficial change, is actually the extended reach drilling. So it's not an area that I particularly was responsible for, but the extended reach drilling that the industry developed up there, allows the wells to go horizontally 4 or 5 miles from a drill site. Whereas initially back in the 70s, especially by today's standards, were much larger. So the drill site footprint was larger and you needed more drill sites because you couldn't drill radially so far out. Now for new fields that are being developed, the area on the surface that's disturbed is actually minute compared to what it was back in the day. So I think that's been a tremendous, tremendous improvement. Well, one thing that we did change while I was up there, actually when I came back for ARCO, pipelines on the slope, we went back up and we were installing the artificial lift and the water flood, which was a tremendous amount of pipelines. Every year we were putting in 100 miles of pipelines that came from the gathering centers, between the gathering centers, and then got distributed out to the drill sites, and then from the drill sites out to the different wells. But initially the pipelines were being built in the summer, and we looked at that and said, oh, the guys are tramping out there, they're sinking in the tundra, it's difficult, the mosquitoes are after them, it's wet, it's boggy. Why don't we, instead of building them in the summer, build them in March and April and May? The sun comes up in March, it's starting to get warmer after the winter. April and May, still frozen, so you have good surface to walk on. But in order to do that, we had to kind of slide the pipeline season 3 months earlier. So that meant the drawings had to be done 3 months sooner down in the engineering companies. Material had to be procured 3 months earlier, had to be shipped to the slope 3 months earlier. Pipelines had to be insulated in Fairbanks 3 months earlier. But once we started doing that, it was just so much easier, so much more economical to build pipelines during the spring season when it was relatively warm, the sun was there, the ground was frozen. That it's become standard pipeline installation now. In the 70s, you really had to make your own fun. BP had shipped up these insulated panels that were the size of a large table. They were like 6 inches thick and 5 feet wide and 10 feet long, and they were worried about water source for the winter when the lakes froze, because the water source for the camps was being drawn from the lakes, and they're relatively shallow. So the idea was to cover the lake surface with these insulated panels to keep them from freezing so deep, so they had water all winter long. So they put them on the first winter and then figured out they didn't need them, so they had these insulated panels stacked all over the place. So a couple guys and I got those, and we floated the Putt River with some 2x4s just for something to do. And then the idea kind of caught on, and we established the first Capark River regatta, because there was no Capark River Bridge at that point in time. So everybody got these styrofoam panels, and they kind of built boats and what have you to have a race down the Capark River. And this pipe fitter and I, we got one of the rafts, and we carved out the bottom, and we countersunk an oxygen bottle into the bottom of it and put a rudder on the back, and we got an air grinder and bent a 2-inch flat bar into a blade so that we could have a motorboat, and put a hole in to open up the valve on the oxygen bottle, and we kind of kept it kind of in disguise leading up to the race. And everybody's kind of gathered on the banks of the Capark River there as people are bringing their boats down for the race. And we come down carrying this raft with the oxygen bottle and put it in. And my buddy had a Snoopy scarf around them with goggles on because we were going to go so fast, right? We got out in the middle and everybody kind of got a lead on us. And I went to turn the oxygen bottle on and started going, but we forgot to put a regulator on it. So the hose immediately burst, just boom, and it just started bubbling, and everybody got a good laugh out of that. We were last in the race. Another good story, though. There was a DC-3 airplane that had wrecked. This was in '74. The wreck was in the late '60s, actually, but the plane was like a half-mile off the road, out kind of where Drill Site 6 is today. But it was kind of like a monument out there, and it was crashed in the middle of this lake. We got one of those styrofoam rafts and paddled out to it, a friend of mine and I. And both propellers on the DC-3 had snapped off when the plane crashed, and it was underwater. So we took some come-alongs out there, nothing else to do, winched the blades, the propellers up onto the wing of the aircraft, and the cowling was still there with the gears that rotated the blades, feathered the blades. But we were able to slide the 3 blades onto this raft, and then he and I got on it, and it was only about a ½ inch of freeboard. We paddled back to shore. So I figured the blades and cowling must have weighed about 600 or 650 pounds based on the water displaced and our weight. And we got it to shore, but we couldn't carry it, so we had to get like 6 or 7 other guys to come out and help us carry it back. We got it back, and there was a medallion on the cowling that said Pratt Whitney, dependable engine. It had these eagle wings. So that's what this belt buckle is actually off of. It's actually the Pratt Whitney emblem off of that cowling. It kind of made it into a souvenir. Well, disappointment, I guess, would be that the gas line is not taken off yet, that it's still in the future. So it'd be nice to see that gas line come to reality at some point in time. I mean, it's been, 50 years it seems like. It's time. I think what's the Ambler Road, I think, is a great prospect for the state to open up that area. We have so few roads. There's so much of Alaska that's isolated. If we just had access and give people the opportunity, you look at the size of Alaska, relative to the size of Indiana or Ohio or these other states, we're tremendous, and we have so few people and such riches that, people could develop and employ and build on. Well, we would still be fishing, although the fishing industry is declining. Timber's out. It'd be relatively poor land, struggling people. I mean, it'd be tough for anybody to make a living, really. Tourism, I guess, would still be here and be about the same as it is, most likely, because I think that's still a great industry for the state. But no oil industry. So many people have raised families, had a good life in Alaska, still have a great life. When I came up, I viewed it as the land of opportunity. Go west, young man. Well, Alaska was still here to keep going northwest, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me, for my family. Growing up here was wonderful for the children. I still think there's tremendous opportunity in Alaska. We still have mining, we have the mineral resources that can be developed, and I still think it's a great place for people because the oil's been here and because there's still oil. Well, I would say the oil industry is still strong. I'd say as Alaska is great for the construction industry. You have military construction, you have the mineral construction, oil industry. It's still a good place for young people. Well, it's personal. Go for the adventure. I would still look for the big projects. That's what I enjoy. A couple years back, they were building the 3rd lane of the Panama Canal. I said, oh, there's a project. If I was graduating from college as a civil engineer or a construction engineer, that'd be the one I would want to go work on. So it's always, there's always interesting work out there.